So good afternoon, everybody who's joining the Care Vision's Healthy Aging conversation this Tuesday afternoon. We're just about to come up to 4 o'clock, so you've got a few minutes to make yourself comfortable. If you haven't got a cup of tea, you can very quickly get one if you're very, very fast, and be ready to start our conversation at 4 o'clock on the dot. I've got two guests with me today who I'll introduce at 4 o'clock. But let me just give you a little bit of the background to anyone who's joining for the first time. So these healthy aging conversations are hosted by Care Visions, who are an organisation who provide care and support to people affected by dementia, and indeed to wider healthy aging support to people who want to live well as they get older, to break some of the mythology that as we get older, or even when we get dementia, somehow we can't do things. Care Vision's philosophy is that actually you can do an awful lot. You just need the right kind of support and the right kind of community around you. And what they've done during coronavirus is produce a whole series of videos, which are available on their YouTube site and through Facebook, which are dementia therapy videos produced by trained therapists to help people live well, even when they're in isolation. They've expanded from that. So these conversations that I host every Tuesday afternoon are part of increasing that understanding about how people can live well and be well supported by the virtual community when the actual real community is less accessible. They've produced and are producing a series of perspectives pieces where people talk about their own experience through life to make us all feel good about what you can achieve. There's a new one going up tomorrow by an explorer called John Hare, who is an explorer, mountaineer, conservationist, and he runs the Wild Camel Association. Now, if you don't know about wild camels, you need to get hold of that tomorrow, because he'll tell you about his amazing time as an explorer and an author. And you'll know more about wild camels than you ever thought possible if you get hold of the program he's putting up on the Care Vision site tomorrow. And then on Thursday, there's another new development, which is another new video produced by Laura Bolton, one of the therapists at Care Visions. And this is about healthy aging in general, not just for people with dementia, but anyone. And it's about meditation. How can we use meditation as a way of getting the support that we need as we live in what is quite a troubled and difficult world? And it's done in partnership with the National Gallery, who've got a wonderful collection of art. As you know, many people have been to the National Gallery in London and seen the art. But what they've done is put the art together with meditation. So you can use a piece of art to help you really escape from some of the troubles of the world and live as well as possible with the world passing you by for a few minutes and letting you have a bit of peace and tranquility. So those are two things coming up. As I say, there's a video by John Hare, the explorer from the Wild Camel Society. That will be up tomorrow, Wednesday. And then on Thursday, there'll be a new video from Laura Bolton, from the dementia therapist who does the dementia therapy videos. But this is a wider healthy aging program. Now, on these healthy aging conversations, we've normally only had one guest, but today I'll be introducing two guests. Last week, just to refresh people's memories, and if you haven't seen it already, please go and look at the recorded version. We had Sheila Robertson, somebody who lives with dementia in her family, not just herself, but her husband has dementia and her mother had vascular dementia. And what was lovely was listening to her about how it's important to see the person, not the dementia, to see that there is a person there who's still got an awful lot to contribute to the community around them and to their family and friends. And I think Sheila showed that really strongly and showed how important her faith was to her. So Sheila Robertson was my guest last week. I'm now going to, as we've just about got to 4 o'clock, introduce the two guests that we've got today. And I'm delighted to have Jabeer Butt, who's the Chief Executive of the Race Equality Foundation. He's done an enormous amount of work over the years with families, on families and skills in parenting, on housing, and on supporting older people. And I'm going to talk to Jabeer about some of the work he's been doing and how particularly he sees the issue of creating a more equal society to support people as they age and as they require more support than they might otherwise have needed. And then my second guest is Ronald Amanze, who is a person living with dementia himself, a musician, music producer, and now a poet as well. Ronald, I'm going to start with you because you're an amazing person. I think you're an inspiration to everyone who hears you and talks to you. Just tell me a little bit about how you see the connection between music and dementia. What's it like for you as a music producer to have dementia?
Speaking from my own personal experience, And it was only after my diagnosis, sometime into my diagnosis, I actually realized the significance of music in my life. And I find music as the most significant form of therapy in my world in terms of me coping with the diagnosis. Something about music mystically is therapeutic in a way that it just music, and you have to forgive me for stumbling over my words, but music. What was the question you asked again?
Well, what's the importance of music when you're living with dementia?
Oh, music for me is very important because it motivates me to actually feel confident enough to speak. Funny enough, I can have a conversation with no music in the background, but when I have music somewhere in the background of my life, it just motivates a different conversation. And because at the best of times, I tend to struggle to explain myself, I often need something else just to kind of calm me down. Like I'm speaking now and I'm feeling all right, but I'm feeling quite nervous. And perhaps if music was just attached to this conversation somewhere, suddenly I'd start communicating differently. Music is the vehicle I need to communicate. It calms me down, it de-stresses me. Not certain if I answered the question correctly.
No, it's a really good answer. Thank you, Ronald. And what about when you're explaining to people you know in the music world about having dementia? When you want to explain to them what it's like having dementia, what do you say to people you know in the music world?
I now communicate through, I document a lot of my thoughts and feelings by writing them down. And I do something which they call dementia diaries. So I write a lot of dementia diaries for an organization in Scotland, Deep Network. And I found at a time when my life was really difficult and I was falling out with the world and I was isolating myself from the world in conversation, I just could not communicate but with other people or share my feelings. But I would stay by myself and find myself writing and singing and composing things in silence or in a distance myself from the world. And I suddenly realized sometimes we need a motivation to communicate. And music is that vehicle that helps you to communicate. And being in the music business, you are ideal, or like I was, I'm in an ideal position to use that ability to nurture not just an ability to have a voice to explain myself, but I can also use music to give me a meaningful value in life, to explore other pathways of living a personal, a private, a valid life, because I now use music to help me to engage in terms of a career aspirations.
Okay, that's good. And the other day when we were talking, you talked about reggae and dementia and doing a project. Tell me more about what you'd like to do about promoting reggae as a reminiscence and something that people can relate to.
Oh, once again, and I'm calming down now. Before a few seconds ago, I'm calming down now. Reggae, for me, reggae is my therapy. And I discovered, because I've been invited to many Alzheimer's music cafes, and I'd go to these cafes and there was nothing there that actually I could relate to in terms of the type of music that I was familiar with, or nothing that I could relate to enjoyably. So reggae music is what I'm all about, because I have an aspiration to actually develop a project which is, I call a creative industries project, whereby people with dementia or health issues, they can remain active by doing something within the music industry, while keeping it culturally relevant, also keeping it doing something that can actually develop a kind of a business. I'm trying to make this whole reggae thing into an enterprise so that I can live a meaningful life as opposed to just being a recipient of music services. I would like to be someone who nurtured music services. I would like to actually be an active developer of music situations that are good for my meaningful involvement in life. And it just so happens to be the art form that I'm involved with, which is reggae.
So if there were people who play reggae music or musicians who are watching this or interested, what should they do? Can they get in touch with you and join in?
What they should do is recognize that they're in a unique position to nurture an art form that doesn't appear on the radar sufficiently, and people have missed the importance of reggae music in terms of its therapeutic value for all sections of our communities, especially if you're a child of the 60s, 70s, or 80s. If you're a child of that era where music was relevant to all sections of our communities, you as a music producer now have a potential commodity that can tie into really being a therapeutic resource on so many levels. So nurture your talents.
Okay, that's a great message. And I should have said at the beginning, but I will say now that anyone who wants to join in and ask a question to either Ronald or Jabeer, you can use the chat function on this Facebook site to write your question in. And if we have time at the end, we'll take one or two questions to that. But Ronald, I'm going to move over to Jabeer, but I'll come back to you because I want to hear some of your poems before we finish. But I'll come back to you and follow up in a few minutes. But Jabeer, I just want to pick up on one of the things Ronald was saying there, which is when he went to some of the Alzheimer's music cafes and cafes, he found nothing related to his culture and his community. Is that a general problem, that we tend to stereotype into a certain view of what people want, which can leave people marginalized? Is that something you found?
Very much so, Jeremy. There's a thing that going around now where lots of adverts say that diseases don't discriminate. But the reality is that the evidence tells us that they do discriminate. The aging process itself is a key driver in the experience of dementia. But there are lots of other things that seem to have that impact as well. And the evidence, as we've started to build up, shows that Caribbean communities and Asian communities are at higher risk of developing dementia and more likely to develop it at a younger age as well. And when you start to explore some of the reasons for that, some of it has to do with the diseases that we're more prone to, such as diabetes, but some of it is to do with the actual experience of coming to this country and living in this country, the work we do, the places we live, the health and care that we've had access to from childhood to adulthood. These have all played a part in increasing risk. And unfortunately, what we've also found is that perhaps the services that some of us may want to use as we become older and as we start to develop some of these diseases of older age aren't really accessible or don't seem to fit with what we need. And Ronald's clearly identified one of those experiences. But unfortunately, we can see that in other settings as well. Some of the residential care, up until quite recently, you felt very alien to many minority communities because there was just nobody there that you could recognize or could associate with.
And how do we go about changing that? What would you say are some of the first steps that could change that? Because it is very alienating when you go from a very supportive community, your family that you know, for anyone going, say, into residential care, that's an enormous upheaval. But if you both go there and then you find it alien to you in terms of the people around you, in terms of the meals that you're given, in terms of the living environment, it does seem a particularly challenging situation. How do we start changing that?
I think the first thing, Jeremy, is to recognize that actually these communities exist for a very long time. That notion of they look after their own has been prevalent, and unfortunately we continue to hear it at the moment as well. There's the assumption that people of African, Caribbean and Asian origin, the families are going to step in and be able to cope and look after them in their home setting. And unfortunately, what it doesn't seem to recognise is that actually dementia is a comparatively new experience for Britain's Black and minority ethnic communities. The immigration process, the migration process was such that it was actually children and their young adults and their parents who came. it was very rarely that grandparents came or migrated as well. And therefore that experience of not only having older people, but older people is comparatively new. Back in 1991, there were less than 50,000 people over the age of 65 from the minority community. Now there are somewhere in the region of 125,000 over the age of 75 from the black and minority ethnic community. So that group of older black and minority ethnic communities has grown. And therefore that challenge that particularly diseases such as dementia pose is a comparatively new one. So families are finding themselves in situations where a parent has become doubly incontinent, something that they just don't have experience. So to assume that you're going to be able to do it yourself, to assume that you'll be able to cope is deeply problematic. Therefore, those services need to be there. And so the first thing has got to be recognition. The second thing is things that you've already started to highlight. If you're being supported in terms of food, it's got to be culturally appropriate. It's got to be accessible. It's got to observe the religious requirements of minority communities. The third has got to be the workforce. If you don't have a workforce that's diverse, but equally a workforce that recognizing that you're dealing with difference, you're going to create a situation where people feel alienated, where people feel isolated as such. Yeah. The final thing I think is some of the resources we have. Reminiscence is a key part of helping older people living with dementia to still have an active life. But if all the resources that have been produced don't recognize that you're there, it's very difficult for us to use. So we need to think about that as well.
Do you think, I mean, recently in the last couple of years, we've had more of a focus on the Windrush generation and the travesty of the way they've been treated. But do you think that started drawing a bit more attention to older people from BAME communities, in that case, the Caribbean community in particular, that previously was forgotten and hidden? Is that beginning to change people's perceptions?
I'm sure it is raising that issue, but I think there's a wider point to be made here, Jeremy, as well, which is that in some senses, this generation of black and minority ethnic older people, that's the generation of my parents, is actually a sign of success. If we look at life expectancy in the countries of our origin, it's not yet caught up with the life expectancy that minority communities here. I know we still struggle to provide the data for that, but actually it's quite unique to see so many of us living into our 70s and into 80s, and it should be seen as a sign of success. Unfortunately, because we've not dealt with some of those issues around discrimination and disadvantage, it's not been the kind of thing to celebrate that we should do. And the Windrush experience is just one of those where in your 60s and 70s, you're suddenly being told, actually, you don't belong here, or you have no right to be here, that we may actually deport you when you've actually spent most of your life here, arrived as a child and now are having to document yourself. And unfortunately, it's clearly pushed some people into further experiences of poverty and disadvantage.
I was going to come back to you, Ronald, to ask you to follow up on what Jabeer was saying. Is our attitudes changing in the black community towards older people and people with dementia? Do you think it's getting better?
I don't think so, funny enough. I think it's very sad. I have a son and daughter in their 30s. I have family members. My mum had vascular dementia. And we didn't, I mean, as I've said before, and I always say, I didn't know the definition of the word dementia or Alzheimer's prior to my diagnosis. Even when my mum had it, I didn't know exactly what she had. The word was bantered around. I think within my immediate community, there's a lot of education to be done. And I don't really think it's getting better. In fact, far from it. I think there's so many distractions amongst the younger generation. They're just missing the focus of other things in terms of care needs. That's what I really believe.
No, that's a good point. Now, Jabeer, I mean, you've done a lot of work on strengthening families and parenting. is there an issue around strengthening the understanding and support for family carers? So there's not an assumption that people can do it all on their own, but also there's not an assumption that people have the skills to do it either. Do you think we need a revolution in the way in BAME communities people see the role of the family carer going forward?
Undoubtedly, I think that notion amongst communities themselves that they'll still be able to care, that they'll still be able to cope, is there, and the expectation, certainly from older people, that their children or their wider group community will care is there as well. However, the challenges of older age are such that we need to become better at understanding how we provide care and support and make sure that people are still able to lead active lives. And I think we are getting better. The number of churches, mosques, synagogues, temples up and down the country that have made real efforts to set up befriending schemes, that have made real efforts to better understand how isolation and loneliness can have an impact on minority communities and what they can do to address that is really important. It's not enough, but it is a sign that things are changing. And I think I'd probably disagree with Ronald here about the younger generation. I think what we're struggling with at the moment is that this is something new. This is something that we've not grown up with, and we're having to learn it. And that's what we need to do. I often have an argument with colleagues about whether there's a stigma associated with dementia in similar fashions to the stigma that's often associated with mental illness. And while there might be an element of that, I think the fact that there is this also a discussion, there's also a sense that this is something new that we're coming to terms with. Once we get better informed, once we get clearer about what it means in terms of what people can do and what they perhaps can't do any longer, I think we will get better in providing that support. The final thing, however, is that there's a problem I think Britain has as a whole in terms of older people. I'm not sure that we give older people the respect that's due to them. I know we sometimes celebrate it, but there's still a lot of age discrimination around, and that's most recently been demonstrated by those attempts to get people to sign do not resuscitate letters. It's clearly been targeted at older people. It's clearly been targeted at denying them access to health and so on. And that's deeply problematic. And this is the system doing it. This isn't individuals doing it. This is a system doing it.
So do you think in coronavirus, the problem's been made worse, where there's been more discrimination against older people and BAME communities? Or have you got evidence that suggests that things are particularly difficult?
It's clearly had a disproportionate impact both on older people and on Black and minority ethnic communities. We know from just the simplest of analysis of death rates that if you're over 80 and develop coronavirus, the chances of you having the worst outcome of all is significantly higher and so on. And partly it's to do with age, but partly it's also to do with your living conditions. Similarly with Black and minority ethnic communities, some of us warned at the time the pandemic started that they were at greater risk because of their life circumstances. And unfortunately, the data started to demonstrate that's the case as well. But these are all things we could have done better with. What we've done around not protecting residential care, for example, has dramatically impacted older people. They're the ones who've suffered most in terms of death rates. And this is something we knew about. This is something we could have done something about. And unfortunately, we didn't. And eventually, when we come to doing an inquiry, we'll have to ask the question, why didn't we do it?
And just one final question for you, Jabeer, before I come back to Ronald. What would you like to see happen now? Because it's all very well saying we'll have an inquiry or have an investigation, but they take years. Meanwhile, people are living with discrimination. They're living with inequality. What could happen in the short term to make a difference?
We have to be taking action very now. And if I just focus on one thing at the moment, Jeremy, which is that we've not come out of the pandemic. We're still in the midst of it. And the test and trace initiative that's been taken is key to ensuring that we protect people better. Yet there's very little evidence that we've actually learned anything from our experience so far. as far as we know, none of the people who are doing the test and trace have got the language skills that might allow them to reach out to communities. Secondly, we don't know whether any of the barriers that have stopped people coming forward from testing have been addressed. We know that there's a fear of losing income. We know there's a fear of what would happen in terms of isolation and so on. Those haven't been addressed. So very clearly we could do better with test and trace, and that would start that process of dealing with that experience of discrimination and disadvantage.
Well, that's a very practical step, isn't it? If test and trace actually recognise that people's different languages need to be incorporated, that would be a start and a much better way than we are at the moment. Ronald, I'm going to come back to you, because picking up on what Jabeer said, how have people in your community reacted to you having dementia? When you've told people you have dementia, what reactions do you get?
Okay, well, quickly, what Jabeer just said, and when he said he disagreed with me, I'm going to contradict myself, because I totally agreed with him. Totally agreed with him. Definitely. And also, in my community, everybody, even my family, they've been like, I was in denial about my diagnosis. And my family are still in denial of my diagnosis, because they don't give me the care. They give me a certain kind of love, but a kind of acceptance of my situation I don't get. And when I tend to be kind of a bit unstable with my emotions, or get chaotic about things, or forgetful about things, or can't cope with certain things, they just blatantly say, pull yourself together. And sometimes I can't pull myself together, because they are just unaccepting of it. And they are also sometimes from my experience, it feels cruelly dismissive of my situation, or people also like myself. And yes, I think education is very much needed in my community.
Are people afraid of talking about it? Do people feel worried and scared because they don't know how to handle it? Is that the problem?
I'd say definitely people are uncomfortable with having that conversation, because I've even myself, I've had to learn to have that conversation and be honest about things that I try to camouflage and conceal. And that's me. Even in moments of greatest need, I still struggle to have a conversation about what I need. And with regards to my family and people who I love very much, and I know they love me, they still find it uncomfortable to talk to me about my health issues.
Do they avoid talking about it at all? Do you find that frustrating?
They absolutely just don't. It's like it don't exist. It does not exist. And when I try to raise it, put it on the radar, they find a way to navigate away from it. So I find it very sad and very disheartening and very frustrating.
Right.
That's my experience.
One of the ways that I'm going to come back to this now, one of the ways that you do communicate is through your poetry, because you found a way of expressing yourself through poems. Would you like to read us part of one of your poems and just introduce it? Because it'd be lovely for everyone who's watching to experience what I've done face to face with you, which is seeing the power and the impact of your poetry.
I got people say things like that. God, thanks for saying that. But this is the poem I wrote because I felt this, no one was listening to me, and I was desperate to explain myself, and I couldn't put my words into real conversation. So I put it on paper, and it's called The Mountains I Still Climb. I'm pushing this poem now because it's now evolved to become a charity record, which hopefully is going to be donating proceeds to charitable causes around dementia. This poem is called The Mountains I Still Climb. You come to see me, but you don't see me. We have a conversation, but you don't hear me. And I've been thinking, if you don't hear me, how are you going to know what I'm thinking? Your eyes fixed on me, sometimes you smile. I always smile, and I wonder if you know why. But if you don't hear me when I'm speaking, how are you going to know what I'm thinking? And if you can't hear me when I'm calling, how are you going to know that I'm falling? And though I no longer dance beneath quiet skies, nor run across open fields, I wonder if you'd believe the mountains I still climb.
Wow.
That's a verse poem.
That's really powerful. And it just goes to show that throughout history, and you've just demonstrated it again today. You can say something much more powerfully sometimes through poetry than you can just through the spoken word. So thank you for that. That's really impressive. I've got a couple of questions, and I think we've just got time to take at least some of them. So the first question I've got is somebody called Jill Tyler, who says, great to hear from both of you today. A question perhaps for Jabeer. Do you think faith groups have a particular part to play in helping to reach out to people affected by dementia?
Absolutely. I think they've led the way up and down the country in trying to certainly address some of the practical challenges of developing dementia. The work that's been done around befriending schemes, the work that's been done about the practical support, whether it's food, whether it's help with medication, help with shopping and so on, that have been key. But I think they also play another important part, which is to actually emphasize that this is another stage of life. This isn't somebody dying. This isn't somebody disappearing. This is somebody's next stage in life. And many faith communities do that explanation much better than many of us can, certainly much better than I can. And it's a really important part of us starting to understand that actually growing older shouldn't be seen as being a disease, shouldn't be seen as being a problem, but should be seen as a success, should be seen as something that we need to be celebrating rather than worrying about. And I think faith communities can play a leading part. But I have to be honest, we all have to play that part. We can't rely on others to say things that we're not willing to say. We can't rely on others to do things that we're not willing to do. We have to also challenge that negative experience that people like Ronald have already highlighted is still prevalent.
And it's a really good point you're making, Jabeer, that as an individual person going to the mosque or the temple or the church, it's down to me as an individual to befriend and be supportive of the person with dementia who's coming to church, or to the mosque or the synagogue or wherever it is, because otherwise, if we assume it's the church leaders who do it on their own, it won't work. It's got to be the whole community who embrace and take on board the inclusion. And I saw at the temple in Southall, in Neasden, that I went to at the beginning of this year, how they'd all become dementia friends, all the volunteers at the temple. And it made an enormous difference because it made people feel it's okay to have dementia and still go to worship, and they know the community around them will be supportive. I think I've probably only got time for one more question. I've got more, but we'll have to skip the others. So this is one for you, Ronald. It's obviously struck a chord with you about reggae music with this person who says, do you think that reggae music will have a positive impact and provide enjoyment for people living with dementia, even if they have no history of understanding reggae or listening to it in the past? Is it a way of reaching out in a new way to people?
I think so, definitely, because reggae music actually has an energy about it, and it's the energy that it radiates that can be applicable to all people. It has a pulse. Reggae has a pulse generally, and that pulse can have a therapeutic benefit and an enjoyment benefit for all sections of our community. So reggae music, like all music perhaps, but reggae music also needs to be in the equation.
And it's interesting that Care Visions, in some of the work they've been doing in Camden in North London, have already linked up with the Steel Pan Society, and they've looked at how steel pan music is a way of reaching and resonating with people, not across communities. So I think your point, Ronald, about using music as a way of reaching out and connecting is really powerful. I suspect we'll have to move on from having talking conversations to musical conversations going forward. I think we're just about out of time, but I'm going to ask one final question, which somebody sent in, Ronald, to you, which is, who's your favourite musician and why?
My favourite musician, I have to say, a group called the Rough Cut Band, who I co-manage. They've been around in England for 35 years, and they've backed all the major artists from Jamaica. So I'd say the Rough Cut Band, not a musician, but a band, a group of musicians collectively called the Rough Cut Band, and they're from London, Alston.
Okay, so a good advert for the Rough Cut Band. Jabeer, are you into music yourself, or in your family? Is music an important part of your life?
Music has always been an important part. I follow in my mother's footsteps in that she never did anything without music being on, and to this day I work with music on as well. And I can't help but point out that one of my favorite bands is Third World, and something I quote to myself and to others quite regularly: fret not thyself of evildoers.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for that ending note. It's a really good note to finish on. And we will definitely come back to the theme of music later in these conversations. Apologies to those people whose questions didn't get answered, but we've had a really full half an hour. We need to end now. But thank you, Jabeer. Thank you, Ronald, for stimulating conversation, giving a real insight into some of the issues, some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities. It's a real pleasure to have you here this week. Just to let people know that next week, my guest will be Ian Sheriff from Plymouth. Plymouth City won the award a couple of years ago for being Britain's most dementia-friendly city. So we'll find out from Ian, who's masterminded that, what it means to be dementia-friendly. And he's also led work in rural communities and in the air transport industry. So next week, please join me at 4 o'clock when Ian Sheriff will be my guest. But thank you once again to Jabeer and Ronald, and thank you all for joining today. Have a good rest of the day. Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Bye.